from Singapore. Welcome to the first panel of Eden's Smart Cities virtual panel series, where we'll be spending the next hour or so having a conversation with two very knowledgeable speakers around the topic of smart strategies to tackle COVID-19. I'm Rachel, the co-lead investigator of the Smart Cities practice at Eden Strategy Institute, and I'll be the moderator for the panel today. As an introduction, Eden Strategy Institute is a social innovation consulting firm, and part of the work that we do in our Smart Cities practice is to help city leaders around the world understand the needs of their citizens, develop smart city propositions, strategies and partnerships, and also assess the impact of their smart cities investments. So this panel is meant to be an extension of the insights that we've uncovered through our top 50 smart cities governments rankings, where we studied more than 230 cities across the world to find the top 50 smart city governments globally, according to a few parameters, such as people centricity, innovation, talent readiness, and vision. And through our research, we found that smart cities have many, many interesting ways of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, some of them successful and some of them not so. Many smart cities have turned to technology and other innovations to better manage their infection rates, improve their city's resilience, and also to look out for the welfare of their citizens. So in today's panel, we'd like to touch upon these topics and more, and discover more about the challenges faced and lessons learned from the way smart cities have been dealing with the biggest health crisis of our generation so far. At the end of this hour, we have a special 30-minute segment that all audience members are invited to, where you'll be given the opportunity to meet and speak with our other audience members and our panelists face-to-face virtually on this webinar. Now, let me give a very warm welcome to our two speakers for the day who are joining us from two very different parts of the world. Ms. Alexis Wichowski from the city of New York and Mr. Takehiko Nagumo from Smart City Institute, Japan. Before we jump into the discussion, I'd like to give a brief introduction of our speakers and share a bit about their background in the smart city space. So Alexis currently serves as the Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Innovation at the City of New York, and she was very heavily involved in a lot of the city's COVID-19 response work. And at the same time, she's also a professor at Columbia University, where she teaches on government, media, and technology. Alexis has many years of experience in the government, having previously worked at the US Department of State's Office of E-Diplomacy, the Permanent Mission of the United Nations, and the NYC Department of Veterans Services. She's also an avid writer, and she writes regularly on the topics of technology and government, and she recently released a book called The Information Trade: How Big Tech Conquers Countries, Challenges Our Rights, and Transforms Our World, where she writes about how the unchecked rise of tech giants like Facebook, Google, Apple, and Amazon is influencing our world in many seen and unseen ways. Takehiko, or Tak, is joining us from Tokyo, and he's the founder and executive director of Smart City Institute Japan, and also at the same time is a senior managing executive officer at Mitsubishi UFG Research and Consulting. He has spent many years dedicating his life to conducting research on and designing digital government and smart city policies, and is also an advisor on numerous boards of the Japanese government, such as the Regulatory Reform Promotion Council and the Information Technology Agency. And like Alexis, Tak is also very active in academia, and he's serving as a professor and fellow at places across the world, such as the Kyoto University in Japan, Tallinn University of Technology in Estonia, and the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia. So thank you again, Alexis and Tak, for being with us today. Both of you sit at the very interesting intersection of policy, technology, and cities. And I'd like to kick off the panel with my very first question to the both of you, which is a bit personal so that our audience gets to know you a bit better. What is it about smart cities that you most care about? Is it the technology, the policy, the people, or is it something else? Alexis, could you maybe take this first question?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I am not able to turn my video on. I think that you have to do that on your end.
Give me a second.
Ah, there we go. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. So I think that my greatest interest in smart cities technologies is in the ways that it can help people access the many services and opportunities that cities have inherent within them already. Cities are wonderfully rich and diverse places, and unfortunately, not everybody has the same opportunities to benefit from all of the things that cities have to offer. So when I think about smart cities technologies, I think about the ways that we can reach people who may not be aware of opportunities that are right around the corner, or to connect with people who are in very different places, just who have similar interests. So I really think about the technologies as a connection tool that will help expand people's horizons and help them to reach broader communities.
And thank you very much for that, Alexis. What about you, Tak?
Okay, thank you, Rachel, and hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here with you today. Yeah, I am most concerned about the purpose of the smart city development. We used to be fascinated by the technology, AI, IoT, big data, robotics. Sounds futuristic, right? Sounds attractive. But at the end, you really have to focus on the purpose of the making smart city, like well-being of the people, quality of life, life satisfaction, so forth. So without that, the making of the smart city is not sustainable. So that's the very important stuff. And as an extension of that, we really have to have people involved in the process. So participation of the citizens is key for the long-term success of the smart city making. Thank you.
Thanks, Tak and Alexis. And I think that ties very nicely into the topic that we're interested in today, which is the role of smart cities in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And both of you come from two different cities in different parts of the world. And I'm sure there are many different strategies that you've been exposed to in how these cities have been responding to the crisis. Alexis, I know you've been very heavily involved in managing New York City's response to the pandemic, especially like when it was the epicenter of the country at sometime last year. Could you share with us some of the strategies that your city employed in dealing with the pandemic?
Sure. Yeah, it was definitely a challenging time back in the spring of 2020 when New York City was the global epicenter for COVID outbreak, and it caught us. It happened very quickly. So there was not much time to plan and make strategies. We really had to just jump into action and to react. So there were sort of two focal points. One was how we were going to deal with the immediate crisis. And then the second one was how we were going to think about our approach and our response for the coming months that we would be moving into. So our immediate response was really an all hands on deck kind of approach, where everyone who had any capacity in any of our agencies was put on crisis response in some sort of fashion. So our office was responsible for helping to coordinate the data that was generated from all this activity. It was, on the one hand, wonderful that we had such a robust group of people across city government that we could ask to step up and help out. But all of that work creates data. And it was not in the beginning clear how we were going to access the value of that data. It was being shared on an ad hoc basis in spreadsheets that were not connected to any sort of central database. So we very quickly realized that we needed to enlist more help. So this is one of the first things that we did also was we were getting a tremendous outpouring of interest from the private sector and from individuals who worked in the tech sector saying, you know, I work at Google or Apple or Facebook, but I have extra time. I want to help. What can I do? So we used these technology volunteers to help us build very quickly dashboards that would help us integrate the data into some sort of integrated fashion. And so we could not only see what the situation we were dealing with was today, but predict what we would need to be working on in the days and weeks to come. So that was our primary focus, was to figure out how do we coordinate all of our efforts and make sense of the trends that we were seeing through integrating our data and having some sort of analytics that we could apply.
I see. And it sounds like it was like a concerted effort between private sector, public sector, and also citizen engagement, I suppose, in getting all hands on deck in dealing with the pandemic.
It really was. And that's one of the strange things about these crisis moments is that it's very community oriented in a lot of ways, in the sense that people from all different walks of life raise their hand and say, how can I help? Put me to work. And the outpouring of that goodwill was something that was really unique. And I've only ever seen before, I think when New York City had responded to 9/11, it was that kind of comprehensive response that people just wanted to do whatever they could to help out.
And sometimes it takes a crisis for these things to become more apparent, right? And Tak, I saw you nodding just now in agreement with Alexis. Is that something that in Tokyo you also saw as a way that the city responded to the pandemic?
Yes, right. So I think the pandemic was a trigger to, how to say, enhance collaboration between public and private and the people. So I think it's resonating around the world, actually. So, if you rely on the government, it's not really sufficient. If you rely on the corporations, it's not sufficient. Really have to work together. That's the only way we can move forward and without fragmenting the society. So that's the common feature, I guess. And then to talk about the role of the smart city in Japan in the context of the COVID-19, I think it's playing two major roles. It's first of all, the technology side. The technology is changing the way we work and live. If you think about the Japanese, the office style, everyone go to the office, commuting on a crowded train, spending 1 hour, 2 hours, and then at the office, you use the paper and the stamps everything, right? That is the cause of the infection. So we had a chance to look back what we should do to change our way we work in the office. So the technology will eliminate the necessity of the stamping, paperwork, and so forth. So in conjunction with the implementation of the digital government, we deregulated on the use of the stamps. So you don't need to go to the office at all nowadays. Of course, there's some inertia, you're right. Some people are still used to the old fashioned. So there's some people still going to office to do some old fashioned work style. But, gradually we're shifting to work from home, no community into school or office, the online medicine, online education. So life is changing. That's the first change we see in the context of the smart city in Japan. Second is the policy decision to diversify the use of land. We have concentrated everything in Tokyo or other major cities like Osaka or Nagoya. That was the magic of the growth for the Japanese company and Japan as a whole. But the concentration turned out to be an incubator of the virus infection. So the government decided to diversify the risk in a way. So we are going to locate 100 smart cities in different locations in Japan. So don't put all the eggs in one basket, simply put. So that is really happening. So the first one was more of the cyberspace oriented response. The second one is more physical oriented response to the COVID-19. Two are happening at the same time right now in Japan.
I see. And both are extremely important, I think, both the technology aspect and also the urban planning aspect, the things that we might have to reconsider after the whole pandemic is over. Alexis, I'm quite curious, when you were talking about the collaboration between public and private as well as civic, what was the role of technology in this whole collaboration, and or maybe some innovations that came across, that came up with the technology that was employed?
So one of the things that was most apparent to us at the very get-go was that, as Tak had mentioned, there was a lot of people working in government who were still used to paperwork and doing things in these kind of old-fashioned methods of emailing Excel files to each other instead of working into a collaborative way into a dashboard or a database. So one of the first things that we did was, with our volunteer technologists, we worked with our across agency partners to, instead of having people keep their data on their own computer or email it to each other, to feed it into these centralized databases so that that data could be aggregated and we could gain value from it. And that took some changing of minds. People are set in their ways sometimes, and it takes some some convincing to persuade people to do things differently. So one of the things was that was very apparent in the beginning was that technology was part of the solution, but it was really the relationships that had to come first, to convince people to use the new technologies, the new practices. So as much as technology is a solution, it only works as far as people will permit themselves to engage with it. So that was one of the things that we found. Another thing that we found was that the tech sector was very eager to show how they could be useful in ways that city governments maybe aren't as quick to respond to. So for instance, we had a number of residents who are not connected to the internet. There's still a digital divide in New York City, and we are working to change the landscape to address that. But in the short term, we just needed people to get online immediately, and so they could go to school, they could go to work. And we saw a lot of the private sector step forward with creative solutions with, for instance, mobile hotspots, literally driving vans and parking them in front of apartment buildings. So they would have wireless connectivity for those apartment buildings, and deploying other methods like that so that people could get online in the very short term, immediate access to the technology. So we saw this combination of both changing the way that work culture interacted with technology, but also with the private sector, the speed with which they were able to move when given the go-ahead was really quite striking, and I think helped people in government recognize that digital transformation is here. It is not something that's 10 years down the road anymore. It's coming faster than we can absorb it almost, but we have to adapt, because this is not, as Tak said, this is an opportunity to rethink the way that we work and rethink the way that we live. And we cannot afford to let government fall behind in this digital transformation.
Tak, is that something that you also saw in Tokyo or in other parts, in other cities in Japan?
Right. So first of all, I agree with Alexis. It's 100% agreed. And something I observed in Japan as a prominent phenomenon is that the rise of the civic sector. The civic tech played a huge role in terms of the communication under the pandemic. We have Code for Japan, which is a civic tech organization, parallel to Code for America. We have such people working for from the civic sector. They created a dashboard to indicate how many are infected, how many are heavily infected, and availability of the hospitals and so forth. And then they outsourced the code so that the many cities can duplicate the efforts. The design were a little bit different, but the overall same information were shared around the countries so soon. So the catalyst of the change was in part driven by the civic sector. That was a new finding. And then there's the leeway towards this performance. We had a big earthquake 10 years ago in the eastern part of Japan, right? And tsunami was the kind of notorious news you might have heard already. And then the power plant, atomic power plant was damaged, right? And at that time, the civic sector played a huge role. And I think the lesson learned from that accident 10 years ago was bloomed this time as a key success factor for communicating and engaging people to the digital transformation of the Japan today.
I see. And this, I think, brings up the very interesting idea of frugal innovations for cities, that, smart cities is not necessarily about having the state-of-the-art technology. Sometimes, as Alexis, you said, the most useful thing might just be driving a van with mobile Wi-Fi in front of apartment buildings. And I'm curious your opinions on how COVID-19 has highlighted perhaps the need to focus more on basic infrastructure and basic city needs than all these flashy technologies that we may be so obsessed with at the moment.
Yeah, infrastructure is never a popular topic to talk about because it's not as flashy as and exciting as things like AI or IoT, but it's the pandemic really highlighted just how fundamental it is. And we knew that we had this digital divide in New York City, and we're already working on strategies to make sure that neighborhoods that were disconnected would have the infrastructure they needed. But with the pandemic, it just became so clear that we didn't have 5-10 years to wait, that we really had to make this happen now. So the city made some investments in digital infrastructure that were at a much greater scale and a much faster timeline than we were originally planning, on the one hand. And then there were also a number of short-term interventions that we tried. For instance, we partnered with some private sector firms to send internet-connected tablets to older adults who were living alone in public housing. So even though they this wouldn't be the permanent solution for getting their neighborhoods wired, at least it got some basic technology into their hands so that they could connect to the outside world, they could connect to their family, take advantage of telemedicine and other kinds of online services. So I think that for all of the exciting new emerging technologies that are out there, we still have to think back to what are the fundamentals that we can't just leapfrog over. We need to make sure that we don't leave behind the people who have been sort of overlooked maybe in the digital transformation, and get them up to speed with not just the tools and the infrastructure and connectivity, but also the training. So we offered training programs for digital literacy to the people that we sent tablets to, so that they would not be just left to wander around the internet on their own, but we would help them navigate the tools that we were giving them.
I know Japan is a very systematic society, and I'm wondering, you know, if it experienced the same things that Alexis was talking about, where the government came in with, you know, simple innovations in a systematic way, but also in a targeted way, right, to ensure that all citizens are involved in this response to the pandemic.
Right. So first of all, again, I agree with Alexis. We focus on the latest technology doesn't necessarily, excuse me, resolve the issues. Rather, technologies doesn't need to be the latest one. How you use it, for what you use it, is the most important. So again, both the government and corporations and civic sectors refocus to more fundamental stuff, right? So let's say we used to focus on autonomous driving. It's still important. And also, you know, imagine about flying cars and new type of mobility services, even the, you know, space technology and everything. But, you know, under the COVID-19 situation, you really have to focus on the survivability of yourself, your community first. So the infrastructure for the education, medicine, communication, elderly support, those are the first priorities to think about. So rather than, you know, the putting huge amount of money for the innovation, we started to think about how can you make those technology available for those needed, starting from safety measures, survivability measures. And then gradually you can step on to something more advanced, more futuristic, right? So that is the consensus of Japan right now. The digital government is exactly the focus right now. We try to deliver cash handouts under the state of the emergency, so that no one have to work, but, you know, get the money from the government, and you know, just be patient until these things get cleared. And the fraction of the population have the digital ID called My Number. So we thought that by using the My Number, we can deliver the cash handout from the national government to the local government systems without any stopping. So, you know, it was a seamless transaction, was as far as we imagined, but it didn't work that way. So there's a disconnect between national government level and city government level. So the city government officials have to go to the office, manually list up those needed to be funded, and then delivered cash one by one. So we recognized that we were not really equipped with the fundamental digital technology to support such fundamental part of the people's life. So this year is the focus year for the national government to renew the national and local government's ICT platform. So the tragedy or trauma we experienced last year wouldn't occur going forward. Lifeline, to put it short, is the first priority.
And I'm really glad you shared that, because it reveals that actually not all the strategies employed have been successful, and there are many things that probably fall through the cracks as well. And I'd like to hear a bit more about some of these strategies that were perhaps not so successful, and what were some of the key lessons that were learned through that.
Yeah, so as Tak mentioned, the fundamentals need to be there in order to deliver the basic emergency services and support. And I mentioned this a couple of strategies that did work, such as the mobile vans to provide Wi-Fi and internet-enabled tablets for older adults living alone. One of the challenges that we had, though, was all of our schools, of course, went completely online overnight. And there were thousands and thousands of school children that did not have computers or tablets or any way to get online. Or there would be one computer for the entire family, and there would be multiple children that needed to access their classes. So we very quickly were able to distribute the tablets and the computers for students who needed to get online, but they didn't necessarily have the bandwidth in their apartment buildings that was fast enough to support Zoom calls. So, video is very bandwidth intensive. And when you have a family of 4 people and everyone's trying to do video calls at the same time, there's going to be difficulties. So one of the things we realized was we needed to set up alternative locations for students to go, maybe even in their own apartment buildings, just using common spaces where we could upgrade the Wi-Fi and upgrade the internet bandwidth so that it could support multiple devices. So that was something that we learned the hard way when we distributed all these devices, but then still found that students weren't able to connect. So we then had to go back and figure out another stopgap measure to increase that capability.
And some of these lessons, I mean, they'll probably endure, right, beyond the pandemic, because you figure out what are the fundamental issues around education, around access to all these digital tools that will probably also last you beyond this, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. It highlighted a lot of things that maybe we had heard of anecdotally or that we suspected, but now we have hard numbers for. We know which locations are in the most need of infrastructure upgrades and which families specifically by name need the technology support that that we can provide that kind of assistance to. So it also highlighted the importance of when we're not in a crisis to develop relationships with hyper-local community organizations so that we had a quick way to network with and get information shared with people across the city. Those relationships are very difficult to generate on the fly in the middle of a crisis. We had a lot of good networks, but it just highlighted the importance of really investing in those community organizations who have their ear to the ground and know what's going on in times when there's not anything going on, so that we can activate them quickly in a crisis situation.
What do you think about this? Do you share the same sentiments?
Yeah. I share the same view, actually. Let me talk about what happened in the Japanese hospital side and the educational side. To talk about the hospital side, we have governmental data collection services called HERSIS. It's the kind of networks of the hospitals across Japan. And then we can get the basic COVID-19 data from all hospitals. So the government can collect and aggregate and assess how it is, the situation is. Like, how many are infected, how many beds are available at each hotel, each hospital in the country and so forth. And the idea was that automate everything, so you don't need to use the paper at all. But overnight, it doesn't occur. The doctors and administrators at the hospitals are more used to the paperwork or the fax machine use. So even if the HERSYS was more convenient, if you get used to it, but people don't get to it so quickly. So they are adamant to use the fax to report the situation. So again, you have to prepare before anything wrong happens, right? That's a lesson learned. The human doesn't really go faster than technologies. And secondly, in the educational sector, under the GIGA schooling initiative, we are distributing the PCs to the all students under age 15. And the distribution of the laptops and the PC, those are rather easy as compared to how quickly teacher can teach online, right? Changing the way teachers teach, how you prepare for online education program, that necessitates a lot of time, particularly the teachers at the fairly senior age. They really have to get educated on how to use the online systems. Again, you have to start before anything wrong happens. That's a lesson learned. Resiliency strategy have to be started where it is still safe, still peaceful.
Yeah, I see very strong parallels between what you're saying, Tak, and what Alexis was sharing earlier about how difficult it was to get people to use and combine different spreadsheets, and everyone was sending Excel sheets to each other. A lot of it is behavioral, right? It's about the mindset change, about the training needs of people, and as Tak, you were saying about how for the elderly or the older teachers, it's probably a bit more of a stretch for them to also get into this digital divide. And I'm curious if there were any any measures that that you saw that was supposed to help smart cities ensure that no citizens get left behind, especially those that have less access to technology or those that are less digitally savvy.
So one of the things that we realized early on with these training, with the distribution of computers and tablets to students, was that there was also a number of families living in shelters and the homeless population where the shelters were not wired for wireless internet, for instance. So even if we were able to get the children who were living in homeless shelters technology, there was no way for them to get connected to the internet. So we had to go through, and there was this twofold effort of both getting all of the shelters wired quickly for that connectivity, but also recognizing that the social workers who were administering programs in the shelters, they're not trained necessarily to do digital literacy programs. They're trained to help with other social services. So I think we recognize very quickly that it's not reasonable to expect the existing staff, whether it's in a school, as Tak mentioned, with teachers, or in a shelter situation, to just somehow magically know not only how to use technology, but how to teach a certain population how they can use technology. So that's very specialized kinds of training that people can't just pick up overnight with no warning. So we recognize the need for digital inclusion and digital literacy programs that were tailored to different audiences. So working with older adults, we worked with a wonderful partner who specifically provided training for senior citizens to use online services. And then we worked with different organizations who were focused on how children learn online, for instance. So to provide that kind of training. So I think we recognize that, as Tak was saying as well, it's people, especially in a crisis situation, want to use the tools they know how to use, whether it's a fax machine or emailing attachments or whatever it is. And so even though when we are in a more comfortable place after the pandemic, we need to focus on basic infrastructure, I also think this is a reminder that we need to keep our eye on incorporating new technologies into our practices before we get to a crisis point where it's forced upon us. So we have to do both of those things at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And we touched on the human aspects of things, right? I was wondering also if you had any comments on, just you're talking just now about the implications of density of the city and how that might have accelerated the spread of COVID-19 in very highly dense places within the city. And for both of you, what do you think are the implications on urban planning or the way that we design cities and spread out cities post-pandemic?
Yeah, let me talk about the direction we are heading to. As I talked, we are diversifying the use of land, right? So 100 smart cities across Japan in different locations. So even if the big cities is down, other cities are up and running economically, socially. That's the way we kind of survive going forward. And of course, we see kind of exodus from the big cities. People are moving out of Tokyo to outskirts of Tokyo, not too far in the region, actually. It's probably the same in the United States, not too far, completely different locations, rather like 1 hour from the center of the Tokyo. So relocating to a reasonable place, the rent is reasonable. Still, you can go to the center of Tokyo if necessary, right? And then you can work online, and you can still enjoy the nature surrounding your new home, right? So what's going to happen is that the center of Tokyo will be a little bit depopulated. So there is a chance for green investment. Less populated, more room for the green, so we can rebalance it. And also at the same time, for the suburban areas, there is a chance for mini urbanization. You can get some amenity to make their life a little bit more enjoyable, right? Small co-working space, some, the cultural centers, place for the barbecue, place to enjoy some of the, cultural and arts activity and so forth. So the suburban areas, which didn't have enough amenities, will be more comfortable for daily life, people staying, not commuting to Tokyo. So you can see kind of rebalancing of the two locations as part of the new urban planning.
Alexis, I know that many people are flocking to New York City as well, even during the pandemic, which is a bit unintuitive for us. Do you agree with Tak? Is there this rebalancing of spaces that's going to happen, you think, after the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that it's one of the interesting things that we saw during the pandemic was people becoming more comfortable being outdoors again. So through the winter, New York City had very cold winters. We had a very cold winter this year, and restaurants were only permitted to have outdoor dining. And we would see people wearing all of their coats and all of their hats and bundling up with blankets to go to restaurants, to sit outside in the snow, to have a meal outside. And I've never seen so much activity outdoors in a New York City winter as I did this year, because people were, I think, going a little stir crazy from being, in their homes all day. And we still have, as humans, this desire to be social and to see people. And so I was really impressed to see how people just adapted by preparing for the weather and still going out and still, we saw this also with parks. City parks were, I think, more full of life and activity than they've ever been, especially in the winter months. And I think that over the course of the summer, as the city continues to recover, we're going to see more creative uses of outdoor space. We've seen theater groups and comedy groups performing on subways and on rooftops. I think that there's going to just be a lot more creative interpretation of open spaces. And so the city council is trying to legislate an open streets program, which was temporarily converting streets to pedestrian thoroughfares, converting them into pedestrian thoroughfares permanently as we move forward to make the city more friendly for pedestrians and cyclists and people just to want to enjoy being outdoors. So I would think that New York City natives are not generally thought of as very outdoorsy, but this year has really brought that out in a lot of citizens in a surprising way.
Yeah, and sometimes it takes us losing something to really value and appreciate what we have. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think we've covered quite a nice a variety of topics. So we've talked about the technology side, we've talked about the human side of things, the urban planning side of things. One last thing I'm curious about, and I would like to hear from both of you, is this idea of data collection and data privacy, because during the pandemic, a lot of governments were collecting data from citizens to monitor their movements for the purposes of public health reasons, right? And I'm curious what implications this has on the data privacy rights of citizens. Can citizens trust the governments that they can give them this data and it will not be used against them?
That's a great question, and we are still trying to solve the question actually in Japan. But we recognize that data can be used for the public health reasons when it's necessary. But where do you want to draw the line between privacy and public purpose is still ambiguous. So we are now formulating some strategic measures and policy measures and so forth to divide the data sets to two different segments. The data set that is characterized as the public goods. So if for the purpose of the well-being and the health of the population, you can use that data set, of course, under anonymous the arrangement. The second area is the data set used by the corporation for competition for better services. And we know that by concept, but where do you draw the line? How can you get the consensus of agreement amongst the citizens is still in the middle of the discussion. But overall, we recognize that if the severe pandemic or crisis situation, you really have to save the life first, regardless. So there is upcoming measures about, okay, under certain crisis situation, there should be a consensus to trigger the use of data for the public purposes. Again, but still abstract, but that's the direction we're heading to. Probably Japan is the most conservative nation in terms of the privacy. If you look around the other countries, they're a little bit more lax than Japan. We are a little bit behind the discussion because of the cultural traits of that, the country. And probably, we will follow some of the experiences in the other countries like Singapore, Korea, US, and European countries to find out that fits into Japanese, the people's mind.
Yeah, so the United States has sort of famously not have regulations around protection of data. So cities have actually taken up a kind of leading role in enumerating what kinds of rights citizens have with respect to their data, because we don't have it at the federal level at this point. The one protection we do have in the United States is about health data. So it's kind of the only class of data that's protected at a federal level. So I think that people were not so concerned about their health data being shared because we've had this for 10, 20 years now. These protections, it's called HIPAA, the protections against sharing of health data. But I think there was a lot of nervousness about what would happen, not necessarily with the health data, but the other kinds of data that was being collected, demographic data or economic data, or data about behaviors or location data, those kinds of things. What would happen when government was able to roll all of that up into a single profile or set of profiles? So there's a lot of work to be done. We, as a city in New York, have enumerated that we've committed to protection of citizens' personal data for city government purposes. But as a country, there's a lot of distrust and nervousness about what government will do with people's personal data. And we still have I think, a ways to go to regain that trust and to enact legislation that will put those protections in place.
I see, and I think to what you both said, this topic of trust is super important as well. Building trust between citizens and the government, because when it comes to the use of data, it's something that it cannot exist without trust, right? And you've both shared very, very interesting insights in the past 45 minutes. And right now, I think the audience has some questions for you. So I would like to raise some of the questions that they asked. So one of the questions I think is quite interesting is from an anonymous attendee. So in making these significant investments, Wi-Fi, tablets, training, etc., how did the governments, or how did our city governments think about the business case of making the smart city expenditure? So in terms of moral imperative, detailed budgeting, impact analysis, what was the business case behind these decisions?
So I can maybe start with that one, which is to say that in the immediate response, it was not really part of the discussion, because the first responsibility of government is to serve our citizens equitably, and to make sure that we're serving all of our citizens, even the hardest to reach and the most vulnerable. So that was really the priority. And this is where government, I think, is really different from the private sector. Is the private sector can do a lot of good for society, but only government has to be fair. And that's not always efficient. It's not always the most reasonable business case, to be fair, but that's the responsibility of government, is to make sure that we take that responsibility seriously. So in those early days of response, I think the real focus was just on getting citizens the tools that they needed. And I think the idea of how this would affect the city economically was something that was looked into after that immediate effort, in thinking, well, if our responsibility is to have a healthy ecosystem, that we need for our young people to be educated, so they need access to online school. We need people to be working so that they're contributing to the economy. So they need access to tools to do their jobs. So it was easier to make that kind of business case after the fact. But I think in the initial days, it was not front of mind.
Okay, so the most pressing reason why Japanese cities are making the smart city is that the aging and the depopulation, which means that we had enough people to take care of education, medicine, whatever necessary in the daily life of the citizens. But in short of the human support, how can you sustain the service we are enjoying today is a key question. If the population is decreasing, and while the people are getting aged, social security needs is rising, and then also the social infrastructures we made 50 years ago eroding right now. So we have to take care of that, but there's no enough people to manually maintain the infrastructure we made 50 years ago. So how can you utilize digital technology to fulfill the gap between the needed support and the real people we have today is a key question. And digital technology is the only solution so far we can think about it. So replacing the physical visit of the doctors by online medicine, use AI and the drone and robotics to maintain and monitor the social infrastructure. So you don't need to spend huge amount of money for manual labor. You can reduce the budget expenditure by utilizing digital technology. That's the pressing reason in Japan. And then, as you know, that Japan is the most rapidly aging society in the world. The other Asian countries, even China, will follow. And European countries are just behind us. And the United States is still young enough, but who knows? So we are the kind of test bed for aging society. And once we can come up with a good solution using the digital technology that can be utilized by any other countries following us, that's the kind of a say motivation we need to solve this question first in the world so that we can contribute to the world. That's the kind of mindset of many city leaders as well.
Yeah, I think this idea of collaboration you were saying, Tak, is something that a lot of cities are still trying to do, better collaboration amongst other cities within the city itself. That ties in quite nicely to one of the questions asked also, which is, was there significant analysis done of the response of other countries and seeing what works and why? So during the time, during the height of the pandemic in your cities, how much of this looking outwards was there?
I can start with that one as well. There was definitely an appetite to understand what other cities were doing around the world, what was working, what wasn't working. One of the challenges was New York City was among the earliest to be kind of hit hard. So there weren't a ton of examples of how other cities had weathered the pandemic. And we were sort of breaking ground in a lot of instances. But as we've moved through the year, because it's been a long pandemic, and there's been many phases to it, we've been able to work with other city partners to learn from them and to figure out what kinds of strategies make sense in the New York City context, or what strategies would maybe not be applicable because of our size and our density and other factors and variables. So in the beginning, we didn't really have a lot of models to look to, but over the course of the months that followed the immediate outbreak in the spring, we were actively engaging with conversations with other city leaders to try to figure out what practices we could adopt.
Yes, in the case of Japan, we looked at the countries like Germany, Denmark, Estonia on the use of the digital ID in the context of the cash handouts, actually. So if you have all the citizens owning the digital ID, which is hooked up to the bank account, immediately you can find out to whom we are sending out the cash handouts electronically, and then put the money into their account without any show-stopping factors, right? And as I talked, we had a trauma of missing that portion, this fragmentation between national and local government systems. So that was a painful, I would say, lesson learned. Our minister in charge of the digital transformation, Mr. Hirai, characterized this as a defeat in the COVID-19 war. So, that's a kind of wake-up call. And of course, we look at the other countries, right? China, US, everyone. And the most suitable solution we're heading to is the use of the digital government to support the citizens in a crisis situation. Digital ID, I think it's a key. And also the digital platform, so to speak. Any city services should be linked up to the platform, common platform for all cities, not city by city, so that the data is interoperable across the cities, and data can be easily aggregated at the national level to formulate the strategy. I think that's the necessary equipment for the current century going forward.
Yeah, it's important to also look back on these things that worked out. What were some of the issues, and as you're saying, Tak, what is the most important thing right now is also to look forward. I think reimagining the future of smart cities. I think we have a question from David around what is the definition of a smart city even. Will it change after the pandemic? Another question also that asks post-pandemic. We have to think about the next crisis that's going to happen, right? And the next one that's looming on our minds is climate change. So, these two questions together really ask this fundamental question of what's going to happen next for cities. How can we be more resilient to the next crisis that's going to come? And yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well. Okay,
this time I will begin. So again, I said that we were fascinated by the technology, futuristic technology per se. So convenience and efficiency, and the future lifestyle, those are the factors driving us towards the smart city development. But the pandemic has turned out to be a wake-up call or something other than that, right? So we are now forced to think about our daily life. So what's the well-being of residents, citizens living in a smart city? So what's the purpose of using technology? We talked about the resiliency of fundamental needs and so forth, right? So we really refocused the purpose of the smart city. Secondly, we looked around actually in terms of the relationship with the Mother Earth, the nature, natural environment. We stepped across the planetary boundary today, thereby the climate crisis is occurring, and the viruses, which used to be, they existed with the animals, are now infecting us. So this all caused by us, human being, destroying the natural environment. So how can you redefine the relationship with the nature and even regenerate green around us becomes so important. So rather than narrowly defining smart city, we need to say, okay, sustainable, smart, and livable cities, right? So we're broadening the definition of the smart cities due to the pandemic experience.
Yeah, I don't think I can say it any better than Tak did. I think that was wonderful. It's really, the pandemic has really, I think, caused this sort of global reckoning and reflection on our values and what it means to be a modern citizen and what we really need to have a fulfilling life. And the technology should support that and should help us to, for instance, make our cities more resilient and sustainable for both our lives now and in moving into the future. But we need to think about what are the trade-offs. We wanted to have, for instance, very modern and densely populated cities with all these technological conveniences, which we created. But then when the pandemic hit, there were, for instance, not enough spaces in the open for people to distance themselves from each other. So we had to shut down streets and open up more public spaces for those purposes. So I think this rebalancing and reorienting based on our values is exactly what we need to be thinking about as we move forward, and using technology to support our goals, not as a goal in itself.
Thanks, Tak and Alexis, for sharing so openly and honestly for the past hour. There are a couple of questions left, and I think some of them we've already touched upon around the use of data privacy, funding and financing for some of these digital, the business models for some of these investments. Yeah, I'd like to actually invite all of you in the audience as well to join us in the next segment of this panel, which is our community building segment. And this is the special part of our panel where we'd like all of you to interact with each other as well as with our speakers. And how we can do this is we will promote all of you to panelists on this webinar. And it's going to be a fantastic opportunity for you to share what your smart city challenges are, your solutions or ideas that you may have with our community of smart city practitioners here. So many of you in the audience are from smart city government, some of you are from the private sector, some of you are from academia. So I think that's going to be a very nice segue for us as well, if you have any additional questions that you'd like to pose directly to our speakers. So please give us a moment to promote all of you here to panelists, and then we can start to say hi to each other and see each other in person.